So this morning downstairs I mentioned that we had two types of teachings from the Buddha about mindfulness, two primary teachings, one from Satipatthana, which is the four foundations of mindfulness, that includes a mindfulness of the body as the first of the four foundations. And then Anapanasati, which is a mindfulness of feelings, in addition to mindfulness of really focusing on mindfulness of the breath, and going through also four parts as well. And today I'm going to talk about the second and third part of Anapanasati, called mindfulness of feelings and mindfulness of the mind. So Anapana means breath or breathing, and Sati means mindfulness. So a good scientist, when he begins to investigate any subject, he goes in with a hypothesis, but not with a conclusion. He has to investigate and see what the result is of his investigation. So in the same way, the Buddha said, when we practice, we shouldn't rely just on what other people have said, but we need to be able to experience it directly ourselves. So in addition to mindfulness, we also have to have investigation. We have to look clearly and see what it is that we experience, and see if it is connected to the teachings or not. So when we look at investigating, for example, if we compare Anapanasati, the breath, the breathing awareness, and the four foundations, we see that there is a close connection between the two. In the four foundations, they talk about mindfulness of the breath and the body, and then the second part is mindfulness of feelings, and the next part is mindfulness of the mind in 16 parts, and then mindfulness of phenomenon. And there are additional sections of Satipatthana that go into great detail, investigating like a good scientist each part in fine detail. In Anapanasati, there is the first part of the teaching. The discourse is about stages of the path. And then he goes into the mindfulness of the breathing in 16 parts. And then goes into 7 factors of awakening and clear knowing and release. And many of these things are also covered in Satipatthana. And if you make a diagram of each, you'll see, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see that there are interconnections between Satipatthana and Anapanasati that show that they are in close parallel with each other. So I want to talk about mindfulness and Anapanasati and the 16 parts. So they're divided into what are called tetrads. The first tetrad is called mindfulness of the body, the second mindfulness of feeling, the third mindfulness of mind, and the fourth mindfulness of phenomenon, just like in Satipatthana. So there's a strong connection between the two. So if we look at the sections, we can see, and already Sherry discussed to some degree, the practice of mindfulness of the breath and the body first. The mindfulness of, in this way includes noticing the inhale and the exhale, and sensitive to the entire body, and being able to calm what are called the bodily fabrication. The bodily fabrication is actually the breath itself. and learning how to bring it into a calm state. So when they talk about this in Anapanasati, it's a little bit confusing to me at first as I'm trying to understand it, because when the discourse begins, they're at a retreat for 3 months. And I think it's because the conditions of the rain hasn't stopped yet, and so it's not time for them to break off the retreat. So the Buddha says, well, we'll stay for another month and we'll continue to practice. And the Buddha goes around to different groups of people and he notices what they're doing, and then he comes back to the community and he says, I'm very pleased with how well people are practicing. And he goes through the different groups. He says, there are some people who are practicing here very advanced, called the Arahats. And they are practicing very, very well. And then he says, there's another group which are called non-returners, and they're practicing very well. And once returners, practicing very well. And the stream enterers, practicing very well. So if you know the sequence of the practice, you know that he's going in reverse order. He's taking the most advanced first, and then going to those who are not quite as advanced, but still who have been practicing very well. And then after he goes through that group, he then discusses people who are practicing the 37 factors of awakening. And he also talks about those who are practicing the 4, what are called the Brahma Vihara, the great mind states of loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, equanimity. And then finally he goes to the last group, and that group is studying Anapanasati. So you might think, Anapanasati is pretty basic. But in fact, if you investigate Anapanasati, you see that, in fact, this practice is very, very deep and has quite a bit to it. Not just a beginner's practice. Although I believe that as beginners, we can start an understanding of this. I was thinking about how to present this to myself and to others, and thinking about how it is that even in the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha talked about, the foundation of the Buddhist practice, there is the truth of suffering, that suffering exists in the world. An investigation leads to what is the cause of this suffering. And then the third truth is this suffering has a cessation. We can stop the suffering, and we can follow a path leading to the cessation of suffering. So these are the Four Noble Truths. But in fact, if we understand the Four Noble Truths more deeply, we can see that actually each of these truths has 3 different levels to them. So there are 12 different parts of the Four Noble Truths. So one part is to know, to become familiar with, to understand, to begin to investigate each truth. The second part is to know how to practice deeply, how to penetrate into each truth. And the third is to be able to realize the truth, to actually have the liberation that comes from that realization. In the same way, in understanding Anapanasati, we can investigate it from these 3 points. The first is just to begin to know it, just to begin to be familiar with what it's about. The second is that we can then learn to practice and penetrate more deeply into the practice. And then, with enough practice in the correct way, we can have some realization that comes from this practice. So I want to talk about it from the elementary point of view. But I want to say something first about mindfulness of the breath and calming the breath, calming the bodily fabrication or the bodily formation. And how in our earlier talks, Xianji Kati had talked specifically about the Tendai school, for those who came to those talks, and how there was a sequence. And in this sequence, one of the parts of the sequence had to do with counting the breath. So when I first started practicing, particularly in the Japanese system, they very much emphasized counting the breath. You would inhale and count 1, and exhale, count 2. Inhale, count 3, exhale, count 4. Just say the number 4, and you get up to 10, and you would start over again. And you would do this over and over again, and if you became more successful at it, they would say, well, just count on the exhale. So just say 1 on the first exhale, 2 on the second exhale. It'd take a little bit longer, and you'd get to 10, and you would start over again. So, unfortunately, I have a mind that I've gotten to know a little bit over the years, and my mind has a difficulty. It's very goal-oriented. So when I would do counting of the breath, I really wanted to get to 10. This was very important for me. So there I am sitting on the cushion, and I'm inhaling 1, exhaling 2. I may not make it to 10. Inhaling 3, exhaling 4, inhaling 5, exhaling 6. And so I would start breathing very fast. Fortunately, I stopped short of hyperventilating. But I was not successful at this technique. So because a technique is just a technique, shouldn't become attached to the technique. But then when I started practicing in the Chinese tradition, I became aware of that there was another technique that I could practice. And this practice allowed me to practice in a different way. And in fact, I could practice by, let's see, okay, yes. I could practice this way. And in this way, when I would inhale, I would say to myself, arising. And then when there was a little pause, I could say to myself, abiding. And when I began to exhale, I could say to myself, changing. And then at the bottom pause, I could say, ceasing. And this allowed me to slow my breathing down so that I could observe, accept, and let go, and have a little bit of waking up occur using these 4 stages of the practice. So I didn't have to count in the first way. I could count in a little bit of a different way. So this was the method that I used to begin to calm my bodily formations. Yes, okay. So, there are many different tools and techniques, and depending on each person, you find a tool and a technique that works for you. Once the mind begins to calm down, and there isn't so much sense data that's coming from the body, we've learned to practice well enough so that the body doesn't send so much information. And then we learn about this chattering away of the mind. we see that the mind is, even if we are not getting information from the body and we're not paying so much attention to the outside world, the mind is chattering away. So the good scientist investigates what's going on with this chattering away of the mind. What's happening? So there are certain factors that the person begins to become aware of as the mind, as we investigate it. And many people say, okay, so what are these factors that are going on as the mind is chattering away? Well, the first two factors is that there's the beginning of a thought, and then there's a sustained storyline that the thought continues along and connects to the previous thought and to the next thought, and this goes on until that subject is no longer of interest to the mind, and then it stops. And then another thought pops up very quickly, and that also sustains itself for a while, and then no longer of interest to the mind, and something else pops up. You can try it yourself. See if this is true. You don't have to take my word for it or the Buddha's word for it. You practice it yourself and see if this happens. And if you happen to have the same kind of experience, you'll see that this is like the ringing of a gong, we say, that a person hears at first the first sound of the gong, and then it sustains for a while, and then it goes away. It goes through this rising, sustained, and then the sound of the gong begins to quiet down, and then finally no sound. But most of us, our minds are such that the gong is constantly ringing. This process of thinking is always happening. It's not necessarily a good or bad process. But what would happen if, in fact, we could train the mind to let go of this process of having the sustained part become less and less and less? We become more aware of the onset of the thought. What would happen? Well, for most people, if they make this investigation, they try it, maybe they will do it for 5 minutes, and they come up with the conclusion, oh, this is too difficult. For people who are a little bit more persistent, they might do it for 10 minutes, and say, oh, this is very difficult. People who are a little bit more persistent, who really want to find out the answer to this question, they might sit for 40 minutes. And they might say, oh, my mind is getting a little calmer. Maybe I'll do this daily. Maybe I can't do it for 40 minutes to start off with. Maybe I'll just start off with 4 minutes each day. And in the morning and in the evening, I'll take just a few minutes and I'll see if I can get my mind a little calmer, get stronger. Like a person who wants to run, they start off with a short distance, and then when their breath and their body is stronger, they can run longer and longer. In the same way, the person practices in this way, their body and mind become more stable, and they're able to sit for longer periods of time, and the mind can go deeper and practice more deeply. And these first two factors of the mind jumping to a new thought and sustaining itself through this thought for a long period of time, and then another thought coming, this begins to subside. Now, we don't turn into a piece of celery when that happens. That's the good news. Still, there is what's called awareness. So what happens with our awareness is something very interesting that happens to our awareness. And that is that the third factor and the fourth factor and the fifth factor begin to become stronger than these first two factors of the onset and sustained thinking. These other factors become more prominent in the mind. And the third factor, good news. What is this third factor? This good is called, in Pali the word is piti. It's very difficult to translate this word. This word, how can I explain this word? So there are different stages of this called rapture. And the first stage, we've all experienced this first stage. Something happens and your body tells you that this is something very unique, very special. And you begin to experience what are called goosebumps. Everybody knows goosebumps. This is the first stage. And there are these different stages of this, what we call this piti, this rapture. I don't like the word rapture so much, but that's the one that's in the text. This connection between where the body becomes very sensitive and you experience these different stages until finally the fifth stage, the entire body is pervaded with this feeling or this flow of this internal energy, we might say, that is allows the mind to remain in this state without being distracted by the chatter in the mind. So this is what's called entering into the first of the four stages of the lower levels of concentration. So this is what's talked about in Anapanasati. So this is actually very advanced to go into this state of deep focus and penetration, and to have this third factor prominent in the mind, along with these other factors that are also taking place. Then, in the next stage, this factor of rapture actually drops off as well. And we are left with another experience. This other experience is called sukha in Pali. Sukha is the opposite of the word dukkha. Dukkha means suffering. So sukha means the experience of a kind of happiness, but not a happiness related to the senses, but a happiness related to your own internal experience. Sometimes explained as joyful bliss. So this kind of deep experience is very profound. Then the mind goes deeper and is able to let go of this kind of experience and goes into what's called one-pointedness. And then in this state, then the person begins to experience what's called a sensitivity to what are called the mental formations. So in the practice, for those who are not familiar with this experience, mental formations are the way in which our thoughts happen over and over and over again, and form an analogy to the brain is like a neural network is formed. So this neural network happens over and over and over again. Then you don't have to think about it. It just happens by nature. If you go to start your car and to drive somewhere, you don't have to read the owner's manual because it's already automatic. Something else that's automatic is like when you're walking. This is a kind of automatic bodily connection, but it's also a mental formation. This is how it is that I walk. So when we do the walking here at beginning stages, it feels unusual. This is not a normal, we say, a normal way of walking. But the word for mental formations in Chinese, Xing, is the same word that we use for walking meditation. See, same word. Why is that? Because when we're training ourselves in walking meditation, we're training ourselves to observe our mental formations. And then we can learn how to calm them without being sensitive. Not difficult, it's almost impossible to calm them. Once you're able to be sensitive to what your mental formations are, then you can begin to calm them. So, for myself, I have lots of mental formations that I'm sensitive of, but many also that I'm not so sensitive of. So I need to learn to correct my mental formations. By doing that, I can then calm myself a little bit better. Sometimes my habit energy from the past gets in my way. I had this experience a few weeks ago. I was here at the monastery and I was in charge, or at least this is what my mental formation told me. My mental formation told me that I was in charge of a meeting to discuss our next year calendar. And we only had a certain amount of time. So my old mental formation came to me and said, you have to be very structured and rush through the meeting. So I pushed through the meeting. But as the meeting went on, I became more and more uncomfortable because this was my old habit energy. Not easy to calm that down. I've been to too many meetings. You know, the most difficult meetings that I ever attended were faculty meetings at Washington University. So this is not easy. To change our mental formations is very hard. Sometimes you don't notice it until you're in it. So this is mindfulness of the feelings. So you can imagine if this is very deep, how deep it must be to go into mindfulness of the mind. So as a psychotherapist, this is an area of great interest to me. So I have to be very careful not to get us to the state of confusion. So to be very basic, just the first level of knowing how to address mindfulness of the mind. The first is to be sensitive to see how much your mind is really awake. Is the mind awake or not awake? Is it sleepy? Is it restless? Is it in the here and now, or is it concerned about other things? How much is it right in this moment? So when we are aware of this, we can begin to be sensitive to our mind. When we know if the mind is awake or not, we can see if the mind is a satisfied mind. Is it a joyful mind, or is the mind in some distress? What is causing the distress to the mind? How do we let go of this distress? How do we steady the mind so that it can be one-pointed? And eventually, how can we release the mind? How can we liberate the mind from what are called the hindrances? So really, this entire section here is devoted to being able to let go of what are called the hindrances, or the 5 hindrances. This is another way of understanding this. Let's see if I can find the 5 hindrances here. Okay. We're getting close. Yes. So, these are 5 things that get in the way of the mind being able to be sharp and awake. So the first of these 5 hindrances is our craving for some kind of pleasure to come our way through our senses. This kind of craving for sense pleasure is very strong. In the Pali word is called kama chandra. Kama means senses, sensual pleasure. Chandra means the inclination towards. In the Chinese, the word is tan yu. Tan is taking the mind which wants to be mindful and replacing it with greediness. Instead of the mind being present in the moment, just having the moment as a present, we want something else. Here the character is money underneath the being in the here and now. And the character Yu is a picture of a person who's being swept along into a gorge, can't even breathe. The water sweeping him through a gorge, rushing. The mind being like this, that the thoughts are rushing through the mind. How can I get what I want? How can I avoid getting what I don't want? So this is the first of the 5 hindrances. The second one is the anger or ill will or aversion, which means that a person is on a path to, when they're unhappy, they create distress for themselves and for others. They haven't learned how to restrain their distress, and so that it comes out in causing difficulty to themselves and to others. The third is the mind that's too sleepy, easily bored, drowsy, no motivation. And the fourth is the opposite of that, too much energy in the mind, jumping around, the monkey mind, very restless. And the fifth is the doubt, the lack of the ability to trust that training the mind can be of benefit. Lots of different doubts that can occur. So in mindfulness of the mind, the idea of all of these is to get to a place where a person has been able to reduce these 5 hindrances so that they don't get in their way. Eventually eradicating the 5 hindrances so that they don't create problems for themselves and they don't create problems for other people. So there are many different things that can be said about this practice. It's very deep, and I'm just going on the first level of just becoming aware of the aspects that are related to this. When we begin to practice, obviously, we realize, my mind is full of lots of chatter. So we oftentimes have to spend a good bit of our lifetime learning how to let go of this chatter. So not going beyond the first tetrad is okay. It's not a problem. See, it's okay to stay with just calming the mind through the breath and through the body and satipatthana. This is not a problem. Eventually, depending on the causes and conditions of each person's individual mind, they may have some ability to be able to penetrate more deeply. But if you're like me and you get too goal-oriented, you may end up hyperventilating. It's going to be a problem. I always like to get to the goal, but sometimes having too strong of a desire to get to the goal, if it's not accompanied by good training particularly, then not a lot of progress can be made. That's why it's very helpful to have a teacher and a group of people that you practice with in order to be able to experience this in a better way. So I know at Washington University, many of your students are here, that I do believe that Dr. Braver, is he still having his once a week meditation in the psychology department? If you all show up there, he'll be surprised. But there's a place where you can practice regularly on campus. So, thank you all for your kind attention. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance.